Hi, this is Steve Eliseo from Johnson & Johnson. I'm joined today by Steve Harris from Frederic Cook & Company. Our topic today is performance-based pay necessary to get pay for performance? Steve, let me ask you this first question. What are the best practices in pay for performance today?
Best practices to create true performance-based pay would include bonus plans and long-term performance plans where structure is an inherent part of their design. So performance measures in a bonus plan are clearly stated, known by participants. Goal levels are set in advance of the year, and then performance results occur. Measurement is made at the end of the year, and results determined, and therefore incentive compensation levels determined. Same thing with long-term performance-based pay. Some metric, financial metric or metrics are established and goal levels set at the beginning of what typically is a 3-year performance period. And the performance occurs and participants are updated along the way on how they're doing. And the results are known at the end of the 3-year period and incentive compensation awards determined. And so whether it's annual or long-term performance plans, best practices are for highly structured, transparent programs that participants understand, that can be communicated in proxy statements so shareholders can read and understand how these programs all work.
Steve, sounds like the numbers are telling the story here. How are these programs doing? Are they getting the pay for performance? Could they be better?
Well, Steve, I would say that the results honestly are mixed. There clearly are companies that have effective performance-based pay programs. They're setting goals that are relevant to them, that are important to accomplish their business strategy, and that reflect the core elements, key performance drivers of their operations. And participants understand what those goals are, they perform on them, they get paid, and the program's judged as fair. But my experience also is that in many cases it is difficult to set goals at the beginning, certainly of a 3-year period, and even a 1-year period, 1-year measurement period, and have the performance at the end of the 1 or 3 years reflect fairly what has been accomplished by management, what the company has incurred in terms of its challenges and opportunities in its business, and therefore the end result in terms of the award based on the performance measured connected to the goal set at the beginning of the performance period may not be all that accurate or all that fair. And it really gets to be finding the right balance. You want to be fair to shareholders, you want to be fair to the participants, and these programs don't always do that. And so the results aren't always leading to a strong linkage between pay and performance.
Now, in your consulting experience, have you seen a company or companies that have thought out of the box, maybe done something different that wouldn't fit the mold of our proxy advisors, what they are looking for, and yet really achieve pay for performance?
I have, Steve. One specific example that comes to mind is a very large financial institution, one of the largest banks in the country. This bank had come through the financial crisis, had come through TARP, but was trying to determine what a fair assessment of performance would be for all the different facets of the bank, the different business lines of the bank. And the process that they undertook was a very diligent one, a very time-consuming one. There were many meetings of the compensation committee of the board. Management was very involved in all of those meetings. And the process was really to go through goals that were set for these business lines and for the bank in total. And so certainly there were goals, there were numerics that were used. But then to look at what each part of the bank and the bank as a whole had done in dealing with opportunities that presented themselves during the course of the year, as well as challenges that were unknown at the beginning of the year. And so the final assessment of performance, I believe, was terrific in the sense that it involved a lot of very informed judgment on the part of the compensation committee of the board, and it created a more fair result in terms of the bonuses across the bank. And so that wasn't structured, it wasn't the classic best practice design, but I think it ended up leading to a very tight linkage between pay and performance.
So that was a good outcome for that bank, but that might not have played well with some critics, with shareholder advisory services or maybe even shareholders. How did that communication go? How did that play?
Well, it wasn't viewed as a true performance-based plan by the shareholder advisory services, like institutional shareholder services. The process, I think, was viewed as fair and correct by shareholders because the story was told very clearly in the proxy statement. There was a lot of description of the different aspects of performance that were considered, how the committee went about making its judgments. And so I think in the final analysis that they got it right. And I think the shareholders saw that, understood that. The say on pay vote was good, was positive, so that was clear. And it didn't quite fit the mold that, you know, that some would want. But I think the right outcome was achieved.
Now, is it tough for a committee, a compensation committee, to go outside of that box of, well, these best practices and use that discretion? Because they know they may be facing into some kind of attacks from critics and from advisory services. What's been your experience?
It can be tough, Steve, for committees to you know, work around kind of the edges of practice. It's not at all uncommon for a board compensation committee to, and understandably so, to want to know, you know, what's the norm, what's the most common practice. But it's also, I think, important for a committee to understand, you know, what's working, what might work better in our particular circumstance, even though it may not be the norm. It may not be what most are doing, but it is what is working best for someone in our circumstances where we have a lot of volatility or a lot of uncertainty in our business. And we want to have a fair outcome, fair for participants, fair for shareholders. And having judgment as part of that process of determining the results is an important ingredient, I think, to get there.
Now, often plans that even qualify for 162M will allow for negative discretion. You can cut awards back, not add to them. Isn't that good enough in terms of discretion and judgment, or what have you seen?
Well, it may be good enough to provide the occasional discretion where a committee wants to exercise some judgment. But the 162M workaround plans that you refer to, I think there are ways to use that flexibility to an even greater degree. There are ways to build in a judgment factor to compensation. You know, there may even be a cost of losing some tax deductibility on compensation. But if we step back for a moment and we think that organizations that use time-based restricted stock or units, that's very important to them for various reasons, for retention. It's an incentive in and of itself in many ways that organizations generally are losing tax deductibility with that particular approach. So, you know, is it worth perhaps losing some tax deductibility for the most senior executives to try to get the right answer at the end of the performance period? And you know, I think it's worth exploring that question in greater detail.
Where do you see us going with this? Are more companies going to try to fit within the best practices box, or will there be more willing to be in the vanguard?
Well, Steve, I see more and more companies asking questions, and companies, I mean compensation committees of boards, senior executives, you know, CEOs, CFOs, heads of HR, compensation, asking questions around how compensation could work as a differentiator. You know, how can we gain competitive advantage with our pay program? And I don't mean paying more, I mean paying differently. And there's a lot to explore here, and I think we've just begun to see some of the ways that companies can tap into doing things differently. And this is one where they can find a way to inject judgment to the process of determining incentive awards, certainly within a framework of goals, of financial measurements and so forth. I mean, we don't want to lose transparency. We don't want the participants to be guessing about what's important, but to make sure that we are doing all we can to achieve a more accurate and more fair outcome at the end of the year or the end of the 3-year performance period. So I think the minority really at this point are comfortable with going very far in this direction, but I think we'll see more openness going forward as there's a greater realization that, you know, having kind of a one-size-fits-all or, you know, being tightly centered around the norm isn't necessarily always the best answer.
Now, if you're signing up for thinking out of the box and being different, are you signing up for a road which requires much more engagement with your shareholders and telling that story? Is that what we're looking at here, Steve?
Well, many companies are already very engaged with their shareholders, particularly the larger companies. And the shareholder groups are increasingly prepared to engage in those discussions. But to your question, I think it's very helpful for companies to be in a position to tell the story very clearly. Here's what we measured, here's our process, here's how judgment entered into the determination, and here's why the whole process is fair. And here are the controls that we have, that we apply to make sure that we have the right outcomes, we have the right balance between shareholders and participants. So I indeed believe that it's important to tell that story effectively, both in writing and in direct engagement with shareholders.
So it sounds like we can think out of the box and do stuff out of the box, but we just need to be prepared to invest the time to engage our shareholders.
I think that's right, and I think that the end result is worth it. You know, better than having a plan that pays out at a high level year after year, and then a compensation committee eventually having what I call payer's remorse, and feeling that you know, the goals haven't been set high enough, they haven't been maybe, you know, told the right information on the challenges or the opportunities to achieve that performance, and then they want to set a much higher bar that then ends up being extremely difficult to achieve, and you know, it turns into a bit of a roller coaster ride of incentive outcomes, and that's not a good place to be. So I think some of this work is needed, certainly, to be able to take this approach, but I think the end result's worth it.
Steve, thank you for your insights on this topic. This is a lot of great information and will be great for our members.